Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is David Livingston. I'm a Deputy Director in our Global Energy Center, where I lead our work on climate and advanced energy. Thank you very much for joining us here today. It's terrific to see such a full room, particularly amid the dog days of August when so many folks in DC leave for cooler, or at the very least, less humid climes. And it's surely a terrific registration of interest in this topic. Before we get started, let me just give a big thanks to Zach Strauss in our Global Energy Center, as well as our terrific interns who are instrumental in making today happen, along with our very talented communications and events teams. They're truly a testament to the assets and the professionalism of the Atlantic Council. Let's dive into today's discussion by noting that not only are you here because you're fascinated by the narratives that surround the climate challenge and the energy transition, but you're likely also very interested in the narrators that help us to understand the complexities, the ambiguities, the leading characters, and the emerging solutions at the heart of this very complex set of issues. There's no shortage of news if you glance at the headlines today, from Reuters to Quartz to Time magazine and beyond, that point us to the gravity and the urgency of the climate challenge. Just this past July was the hottest month ever across the globe in history, in recorded history. And it's all the more notable because the previous record in 2016 occurred, it coincided with an El Nino year, which of course boosted what would already have been a warm year. This year's does not. So the record-shattering July that we've just had is all the more notable. Europe has spent much of the summer months sweltering amid grueling heat waves, while earlier this year we also saw much of the American heartland underwater, essentially, amid heavy rains and flooding, even amidst a critical planting season. At the same time, however, we also see indicators that point us to at least some modicum of confidence and optimism in the global energy transition which is underway. In India, we see renewable energy costs, which are now on average below the average cost of coal power in India. In the United States, we see governors, state legislatures, mayors, utilities announcing mid-century 100% clean energy target or mid-century net carbon neutral target, one after another, in many cases legally binding and enacted by state legislatures. And in laboratories and pilot projects around the world, we also see the technologies of the future being pulled towards commerciality in the present by innovators, by venture capitalists, by public and private finance. And these are technologies, of course, such as carbon capture, advanced nuclear, new battery chemistries, hydrogen technologies, which may be essential tools in deep decarbonization and, as Akshat puts it, in the race to zero emissions over the decades to come. Here to help us navigate these complex set of storylines, and to help us navigate between the shoals of pessimism and optimism, are three leading and accomplished energy journalists from Quartz, Reuters, and Time magazine. And so, without further ado, let me briefly introduce them, and then we'll jump right into today's discussion. Akshat Rathi, to my immediate left, is senior reporter for Quartz, and we're also proud to say a senior fellow here in the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. To his left is Valerie Volcovici, a correspondent with Reuters news agency based in Washington, D.C., covering deregulatory developments across multiple different U.S. agencies and a broad swath of environmental and energy stories. And to her left, Justin Worland is a writer at Time magazine covering energy, environment, and climate change, previously covering health and science at Time, as well as electoral politics at Roll Call. So we've got folks who are familiar with the technologies, with the policies, with the politics, indeed, of the energy transition and of climate policy and the climate challenge. So why don't we begin by at least level setting with an understanding of how they themselves frame their own beat, frame their own project. Akshat, let's begin with you. how would you describe your work in terms of what you're trying to do with it? Not just your job title, but what is it meant to achieve? What is your journalism aimed at? And then how does that inform how you choose between what's signal and what's noise in this very cacophonous world out there?
Yeah, I got into energy journalism, as many people did after Trump was elected as president, to try and understand why this complex system is so difficult to first understand at a layman's level, because until people are able to grapple with the issues, they won't be able to choose the right leaders that would run the system. And I thought the easiest route in was to try and understand one pie of the problem at a time, because taking the whole beat, which is what I do at Quartz, having as the lead energy reporter on the global stage, it's too big a task to try and do justice to. And so I started with technologies, and for the past 3 years I've had the pleasure to be able to cover carbon capture initially, electric cars and batteries, and now next month I'm looking at coal in India. All that time, however, the nice thing has been that looking at a single technology isn't always enough. It's how it fits in the complex system that is the key to understanding what its future is going to be. And so I've used that as a way to create the base of knowledge and look at every other pieces of the pie. And this year, since May, I've got the Race to Zero Emissions newsletter, which gives me, I've been doing that reading for a while, but it gives me the excuse to try and filter the noise into a signal of what is really changing in the energy landscape, in what's adding to emissions, what's causing emissions to decline. And that's been a fun way of doing this.
So you're not just a journalist, but in a sense you're also a curator, especially with this newsletter.
Yeah, and I think that everybody to some extent is that now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. And Valerie?
Yeah, so as a Reuters journalist, obviously we're a news agency and we have to cover all of the kind of major policy rollouts, all of the major announcements. What we're seeing now is just, there is a lot of noise. There are a lot of policy rollouts, or there are a lot of speeches where, for example, there was a recent speech at the White House where the administration was pointing to some of their accomplishments, which didn't necessarily match up with, they were pointing to improvements in air pollution since the 1970s, but not really pointing to, what their contribution is given some of the rollback. So I think that our job is a lot more different. These days, you have to, you have to rely a lot more on, as you always do, speaking to multiple sources, but it's not just straight reporting of a policy rollout or an event. There's a lot more context. There's a lot more kind of moving parts. So it's a very different landscape than it was a few years ago, and there's a lot more noise. There are a lot of different voices now. They're youth activists, then you have your more traditional environmental groups, your industry groups, but within the industry groups, you've got a lot of different positions. So I find that the landscape is quite different than a few years ago, and I guess the good thing is I think we're reaching out to a lot more varied voices covering the beat today.
Definitely, and I want to touch on that a little bit later today as well. First, Justin, you.
Yeah, I think, for me, I have a really sort of unique an interesting challenge of being the only person who really spends my full-time job at Time Magazine thinking about energy, environment, climate. So it means I have to think about, a really diverse set of issues. And I think my sort of mission in doing that is to think, the person who reads our magazine or subscribes to our magazine and reads, maybe a couple stories a year about climate change, how can I make sure that they are in some way up to date about the energy transition, or just the various things that I might write about, on every other month or so. And then in my sort of day-to-day job, I am doing things for the web, but it's also about making things accessible. How do we get beyond the audience in this room and reaching just sort of everyday people? And I think separating signal from noise, I think it's in some ways not having to file something on a day-to-day basis allows for that in a sort of easier way, because you can really see what the trends are and see when is the right moment to chime in and write something. But it's just talking to people and getting a feel of what's signal and what's noise.
That's terrific. I should mention also, we're going to be interspersing audience questions throughout the entirety of today, not just at the end. So already start thinking, if you do have questions, I'll come around soon after just a few more of my own, and we'll do that back and forth throughout this event. So start thinking of potential questions you might have already. I want to ask first, though, what's the most misunderstood aspect of your journalism in particular, or just of climate and energy journalism writ large? Do you think do you think we have kind of an accurate view of both the craft and the output and the motivation of it, or do you think that it's broadly misunderstood?
One thing, I'm not sure it answers your question exactly, but one challenge I often find is talking to people of really diverse views and getting the question, from activists, is there going to be a voice from the oil and gas industry in your story? And vice versa, from someone in the oil and gas industry saying, is there going to be a voice of activists in your story? And I can't promise you either way, but part of my job is to create a narrative, a story, fact-based story about what's happening. And so I think there's this perception that that journalists, I guess, have the flexibility to not present that sort of comprehensive picture, and I think that's a little bit of a frustration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would add that one of the most misunderstood aspect of energy and climate journalism in general is this sense people have that one solution will do the job for us. Renewables will solve the climate challenge. Carbon capture will solve the climate challenge. And I think partly it's because the complexity is not well explained to people, but also it's understanding that complexity once it has been laid down is not easy. And so as a journalist, I find that the hardest part of my job. Once I've done the work of understanding a certain technology, how do I make it work for the general reader who comes to it from essentially no knowledge base? Mm-hmm. And how do I get them to understand just why it's such a complex world?
I want to build off something that both of you touched on. So Akshat, you mentioned basically there's no silver bullet. Justin, you gave reference to kind of on one side environmentalists, on the other side the oil and gas industry. I'm curious whether you as journalists in your work sense that there's more heterogeneity than ever before with how the oil and gas industry is engaging with the energy transition and adapting to the energy transition. At least from my perspective, the research that we do and where we sit, it looks like you have companies which are doubling down on core competencies, which are saying, well, we're going to become more of a gas company than an oil company. You have others that are moving downstream into the power sector, into quite customer-facing, at least companies that they're acquiring, which are more energy services companies than oil and gas companies traditionally have been. You've got yet others that are taking big bets on moonshot technologies like fusion energy, yet others that are involved in biofuels or doubling down on carbon capture. What's your own mental model or heuristic for how to understand the oil and gas industry in the current day and age, and how has it shaped your work or the stories you write? Akshat, I know you just did a recent piece on one aspect of this. So why don't we start with you?
I think the oil industry is confused about the future of the oil industry. It's
Yes.
pretty clear from how, if you look at their own future projections. I had this chart in the story that I wrote, which the headline was exactly that, where in 2040, what might be oil demand? And it varied between, I think it was 60 million barrels a day to 120 million barrels a day. That's a huge difference in demand. And so I think it's fair to say that they are confused, but also we are in a place where that confusion is warranted, right? Nobody knows how this is going to play out. And so to have these large companies make bets that are varied across technology, across policy landscape, some people think there'll be a carbon price, some people think there won't be one, is a good thing. And I think that's also what makes it fun to cover.
It provides a little narrative richness,
Yes.
doesn't it? Yeah. Do you want to say just a quick thing maybe about your recent article about Occidental Petroleum and the bet they made on carbon capture?
Yeah, and I think Occidental Petroleum is one of those. So in general, you can split the oil industry in first two parts. One is the international oil companies, which are publicly owned, and then you've got the national oil companies. And there's a clear differentiation that the national oil companies are far behind on the climate agenda than international oil companies. And then within the international oil companies, you have the European oil companies that are much further ahead in understanding the climate challenge and doing something about it. And then the American oil industry tends to lag. So the Occidental bet was a very interesting one because it came from an organization that was previously a laggard, as many analysts put it, and has leaped over the other American oil industries. And essentially they've made a bet in direct air capture technology, which is capturing carbon dioxide from the air, and they're going to spend up to $1 billion, maybe more, within the next 3 years building that technology out at scale, capturing 500,000 tons every year. I'd been covering this field for a while, and I didn't expect that to happen that quickly.
Interesting.
I think with all of the talk around net zero emissions targets and deep decarbonization, and all of the presidential candidates are talking about it. It's an interesting moment for the oil and gas sector, and I'll maybe speak in particular about the natural gas sector because I'm working on a story about kind of direct use natural gas bans like we've seen in Berkeley, California. And I think you have the natural gas industry now, where a few years ago saw themselves as part of the climate solution, as the kind of cleaner option, are now seeing themselves as a potential target of, some, city and statewide policies, potentially national policy. And I think they're at an interesting moment where right now it seems like they might be focusing on a bit of a public image campaign, trying to remind people that natural gas is a cleaner burning fossil fuel, but people like their gas stoves. It's a cleaner alternative to oil, heating oil, and to coal. But they're also now realizing that we need to start talking about renewable gas and carbon capture and storage on natural gas plants. So they're at an interesting time now where I think that the shift from being part of the solution to part of the problem is pretty rapid.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating moment. Just to think about, this is an industry that's in transition, and I think there are a lot of narratives that have been the narrative for some time that are evolving, and I think oftentimes a lot of stories tend to fall back on old narratives, but we have to figure out how do we tell this really complex picture where some oil and gas companies are doing nothing, and some are doing a lot, and a lot are doing somewhere in between, and what does it even mean to do something? And it doesn't fit with a narrative. And it's challenging. It's a fun challenge, but it's a challenge.
Valerie, you touched on the politics of 2020, the presidential race. We're having this conversation in Washington, D.C., so we should probably engage a little bit with the key focus of this town, which is just that. You had a very well-read article earlier this year that covered in the very early stages of the race, before we had entered into the first debate, writing a bit about the direction that the Biden campaign, according to its advisors, was going, which was aimed at kind of a centrist approach. It sparked a lot of debate online, on Twitter, et cetera, amongst very influential thinkers on energy and climate from across the spectrum. Do you want to talk a little bit about that article. Were you surprised by the debate that it sparked? And do you think that it's actually had a material impact on the direction of the conversation, or at the very least the direction of the Biden campaign's policy?
Sure. Well, I'll speak to the first part of the question. I was surprised at the reaction and the kind of and the way it was used by some of the other campaigns against Biden. So I think a lot of people were curious early on. He had just entered the race. He had not been in the race for that long, and I think a lot of people were curious overall, more broadly, on how the former vice president would approach different issues, and trying to find that kind of moderate or more practical approach that would play, that they assume would play better in the general election. So I think that this particular issue was the first taste of it. It was the first test of it. And in talking about finding a middle ground climate solution, I don't think what they meant to say was middle of the road. I don't think that was the intention, but I think the aim was to try to craft a policy that would be able to satisfy progressives of the Democratic Party while not alienating some of those blue-collar workers that may have may have voted for Donald Trump in the previous election. I think there was a lot of kind of fears of a repeat of the remarks that Hillary Clinton had made about putting coal miners out of work. That kind of that possibility of alienating those voters. And I think what happened was, I don't think that the campaign had, at that point, they were not answering a lot of questions on policy at that point. Their first event was, their first launch event was with a union. So clearly they were sending a message. So I don't know if they anticipated what the reaction would be and how much the activists had been organized and how effective they had been in pushing many of those candidates. I mean, Kamala Harris, on her first day, endorsed the Green New Deal. And this was pushed by a group of young activists that were relatively new on the scene. I don't know if they had calculated the impact of these groups at that time, but I'm sure they certainly had afterwards because of the debate it sparked. So I don't know, I can't speak to the second part of the question, if that accelerated things. That's for others to say, but.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There's so much. I want to go to the audience in just a second, but first, Justin, you're also covering this race. You're covering this, in Washington, D.C. What surprised you most about the way that energy and climate politics has played out in the primary so far? Well,
I think twofold. I think one, I think initially I was surprised at how slow campaigns were to have a sort of substantive response, and I'm on the flip side surprised at how much they can say now. I mean, I think going into this weekend, the state fair in Iowa, and I think I think there's 6 campaigns that have plans out about climate change and agriculture. That's a very specific policy to put out, and I'm surprised at how they have shifted in response to some of those pressures. It's been interesting.
Absolutely. Let's go out to the audience. Do we have any initial questions? Yes, the woman here on the right, and then we're going to take them in groups of 3. So we'll take a little cluster of 3 right here. But let's start.
All right, so as an energy scholar, I've been really happy at the rise of climate and energy reporting. It's very useful to me, and I find it fun to read. But one thing that's really worried me is the sense that it becomes sort of like the sports page. If you're a sports fan, you read it, but if you're not interested, you don't. And I worry that fails to communicate to sort of regular folks out there how pervasive this issue is and how it touches on every aspect of their life. And I actually love that you mentioned the candidates that have started doing the more specific sort of climate and agriculture stuff, because I almost feel like that's kind of what we need in reporting as well, to bring that into many different topics and make it not something that's sort of segregated off. So I guess I'm asking for comments on how resources might be used to do that, if it's important, et cetera.
Terrific. So that's a great first question. And if you could just identify yourself and your
Hi,
affiliation.
I'm Nina Kelsey. I'm a professor at George Washington University.
Terrific. Thank you. If you could just actually pass the mic right down the road to the woman right in the middle there. Yep.
Hi, I'm Jackie May, and I'm an intern at Defenders of Wildlife, and I'm doing policy research for their renewable energy team. And I was very surprised over the course of the summer over how cheap renewable energy is. So it's become very popular, but do you guys think there's still any economic barriers to renewable energy development despite that? And if so, what would they be?
Terrific. Great. And yeah, we'll take the question right here.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and we do 4 weekly TV shows on this topic, and this is our 11th year doing it. And but looking at the best practices going to specifically to India, we do a lot of work with India. We had some projects going on just today as far as air conditioning and carbon capture and all that. But what are some of the best practices that you're seeing that you think has the potential for not only India, but that entire Southeast Asia area, and then back that into the United States? And then to the other two is, what are you seeing as far as your research and more advanced technologies like carbon capture and other types of technologies that are coming to the fore at this time to really, that's on a fossil fuel side, but yet they're still trying to make strides to clean the environment, and how you think that's balancing out? And thank you for being here.
Great, and thank you. Thanks. 3 terrific questions. So we have reaching, how do we reach general audiences and break through the bubble, the cost trajectory of renewables, and maybe some challenges that lie ahead, and then lessons from India's energy transition, as well as technologies like carbon capture. Great. Who wants to take the first one?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think we put a lot of energy into at times is telling stories about people, starting with the person and then expanding, to try to get into the policy nuts and bolts that way, or telling stories about, a community could be a character, like go to a town that's trying to go renewable, 100% renewable, and look at the challenges and have characters. I think that's a way that we try to do that. I mean, I think it makes sense to break things off into small policy issues as well. That was probably something I could do more.
I would say I started in journalism as a science journalist. I have a background in science, and the primary difficulty of science journalism is making people interested in quantum physics or lab, mouse studies. And so coming to energy was actually easier in a way because people understood these things at a much better level than the subjects I was covering previously. Having said that, I think having showing people how energy affects each aspect of their life is crucial in getting a wider readership. And I think that is what you're saying, that there are people who love this area and read about it, and then others who do not touch upon it at all, and I think that's quite true. One of the things that I enjoyed in the last few years, we did a survey of the newsletter that I run, and the readers are everywhere from teenagers to people who are retired. And so to me, that was a signal that people are now more interested in this subject, and I think it's only gotten better since.
And I think also the impacts of climate change are affecting, it seems that people are now really beginning to identify this as a local issue. So floods in the Midwest, the Paradise Fire, these are becoming local issues, and I think the local news, to the extent that we still have vibrant local news coverage, is covering climate change as a serious issue. They're connecting the dots directly. And I think just generally, Reuters does polling with Ipsos, and our polling found that 70% of all voters across parties feel that climate change is an imminent threat and demand aggressive action. There is differences about how much people would be willing to pay to combat climate change, but there's a very widespread acknowledgement that climate change is happening, and it's happening in their backyard.
And I would add that one thing that helps me write stories, and I think this is true of journalism in general, is I would write something because I'm excited about it in some way. I mean, it might be a difficult story to tell, but it's exciting in whatever facet. And the best conversation for that is to have it with your editor, where you say, who does not know anything about this energy world, why this is so exciting. And so that why, that one line or two lines that you're able to pull out is what will then get to the general reader. And I think that's applicable outside of journalism. This is not just, it's just a communication skill to have.
And any of the other
Yeah, I'll
issues?
take the India question. I think best practices, I would say, I mean, as David said initially, it's very clear that the cost of renewable energy, especially in Southeast Asia, given how rich solar resources the region has, is now sensible choice. And what is the difference is that there'll always be a lag, and I think this addresses the second question in some way. Even though the costs of renewables have come down, there will be a lag between now and when they get to deployment, because you have all these assets that are non-renewable, that are generating power, that have long economic lives that they need to be going through. And so that lag, how do we cut that lag down, is the real question, not so much can we lower the cost of renewables further.
Great. Anyone else? No? Perfect. I just want to ask real quick, speaking of kind of this international discussion, what's the, to what degree have any of you sought to try and cover this from a foreign policy perspective, climate change and foreign policy? How does that get even discussed in a newsroom? I'm curious, even if it's not part of your beat, when it does come up, how do those discussions play out? And how do you think about climate change, not just as national environmental policy, and that's whoever covers EPA and all of that, but what are the international and geopolitical dimensions of it? How does that play out?
Oh, I guess one aspect is I'm just thinking about it now as I'm looking ahead to the UN climate summit that will take place in New York in September. I know the current special envoy for climate is really trying to get the EU to ratchet up its ambition. It's trying to get India and China to ratchet up their ambition. And it's kind of interesting to think about how he's going to do that without the United States in that leadership role. And I had covered several climate talks. I hadn't covered it the last 2 years, so I'm kind of interested in looking at how do you ratchet up ambition when you have the United States, the United States as a president that doesn't believe in climate change, that aim to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. At the same time, you have these record temperatures everywhere. You have just the those images of the ravages of climate change taking place, gripping every part of the world. What is that U.S. leadership void going to look like this year? Especially, there seems to be this added urgency. So I've been thinking about that.
I remember this quote that Christiana Figueres, who was the chief negotiator at the UN when the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, I think this is a quote from 2017 or maybe early 2018. She said, I am getting ready to write a thank you note to Trump, which was interesting because she thinks that having Trump has made the climate issue a more important global issue at the foreign policy stage, at every dialogue. Now you go to the G20 or the G7 used to put out climate statements as they did in the past. They were, we agree on all these things. Now you have somebody who does not, and that makes it a headline. I mean, that there's a bias in journalism in that, but that brings the issue to the front that it wasn't in the past. And you're seeing the reaction from states and cities and corporations here in the US who are defying what the Trump administration is trying to do. And so her thank you note to Trump makes sense to me in a way, which is interesting. I would not have thought that when I started covering this.
A rebound effect, as
Yes,
it were. Yeah,
yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Justin?
I mean, I think it's interesting. It's an interesting challenge sometimes to try to convey, coming back, going to a climate talk and then coming back and trying to convey how important this issue is to a lot of other places. I mean, I think it's interesting. The UK, is going through Brexit, but at the same time, Theresa May's last thing was to, get a law committing them to net zero. I mean, it's just a completely different context, and I think there is that challenge of explaining that here. But I think the way, I try to cover it as, my last big story was a story about international climate politics and about how small islands have inserted themselves into that conversation, and it was sort of an effort to explain the dynamics of the geopolitical dimensions of this, using them as a lens into it. But it's hard because a lot of times the question that I get is, well, what can the small islands do? What can anyone do? What kind of leverage do you have with international climate politics? And I think it's just sort of a gap in how Americans view some of these things.
Absolutely. And just to pull a little bit more on the thread, asking the question about carbon capture. On the one hand, you kind of have a lack of leadership, perhaps one might say it, symbolically or at a diplomatic level, at a high, kind of a high level. On the other hand, I think it's not a stretch to say the United States has done more to has done more to advance commercialization of carbon capture technology, at the very least, than any other country in the world. It's the only federal carbon price, you could say, that exists is a tax credit actually for carbon capture, which is probably going to double the amount of existing or planned carbon capture projects in the years ahead. How do you discern how to tell that story versus the loss of leadership at a higher level or at a more symbolic level? Is that emblematic of kind of the complexity of telling this story and trying not to paint it with too broad or too black and white of a brush?
It's a great carbon capture 45Q, which you were alluding to, is a great strange bedfellows story, which I think gets a lot of traction, which is look at how you can build, how coalitions are built around things that you might not expect. And I think there's lots of stories like that sort of in this space, and I think it's super interesting, and it's something that people like to read.
I would say that narrative is actually pretty straightforward as I see it, which is that the US is the leader in pretty much every technology at an early stage and then loses that advantage. You can take that for solar, you can take that for wind, you can take that for batteries, you can take that for carbon capture. We don't know whether it'll lose its leadership there. It does definitely have a position of leadership there, but that probably addresses a bigger systematic issue in the US, which is thing that the country's forgotten what industrial policy is or can be used for as an economic power. And you're seeing other countries, Germany, the UK, and of course China, take that lead and make something of it. So does carbon capture go down that route? The chances are pretty good.
This makes a great point about the geoeconomics of the clean energy transition, the clean energy race. So quickly, before we go out for another round of questions, I just want to ask a follow-up there, Akshat, because you've written and asked a lot of good questions about this. Why is it that we've seen that continual trend of early stage technology leadership in solar, in wind, in lithium-ion batteries, only to lose that leadership to basically scale manufacturing on the part of a large market like China with some industrial subsidies, et cetera? Why have we seen that in those energy technologies and not in semiconductors, for example, where despite repeated efforts and concerted efforts on the part of China over the last few decades, you haven't seen, maybe we will in the next few years, but you haven't seen to date that concession of a leadership position in that technology?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think if you leave energy technologies out, that's true of AI, that's true of Silicon Valley. There are still industries that the US has been able to start and make most of it. Why is it that energy has lagged out, especially when in the last 20 years or so, you've had the creation of ARPA-E, which is the Advanced Research Agency, created based on DARPA, which is the defense arm. You've had DOE funding going into these technologies. It's a good question, and it would be a fascinating story to write. I don't really have an answer there, though.
Great. All right, let's take some more questions. And we've got a lot of hands here. Let's start with the two women right here in this row right here, and then we'll work our way back. We'll do a couple rounds of questions. We'll take three initially.
Karen Florini with Climate Central. David, you asked the panel the question about what do people tend to most misunderstand about the craft of climate and energy journalism. I want to ask the panel what their readers are most likely to misunderstand, either implicitly or explicitly, about the substance of climate and energy.
Great question. And so let's go back to the gentleman right behind her, right there.
Hi, Frank Masano with Bracewell. As you guys know, I've been working on these issues for quite some time. So, and I think there are two things that I'd like to get your perspective on. One, historical perspective on the debates of climate change and the science and the technologies, because it seems like we're always at a stage where something is happening and it's the next big thing, and then it goes into a dip and then it comes back. I mean, we've seen that with hurricanes in 2005, and now we're fires and hurricanes again. That's the science side, but also that happens on the technology side. And then secondly, I think infrastructure and transmission infrastructure seems to be one of the huge keys to driving any type of innovation, whether it's gas, whether it's renewables or whatever. And I'd just like to get your offshore wind, for instance. How does that play in, and how do you explain that?
That's great. And let's just take one more. The gentleman right there with his hand up.
Hi, Bill Brandon with Industrial Ecosystems. I can be a little bit of a wonk on some of these things and have some specialties, but also generally read in the subject. And all three of you have, I think, appropriately focused on what your readers are, because I would include you in the popular media, so to speak. It seems like to me quite often the stories that are covered in the popular media are stories that are been able to have some hype developed from them. And quite often it seems like that some of these technologies are a lot of BS, but there are other ones that don't develop that hype that don't get covered. So as an example of that, I would have carbon engineering that Chevron and is that the one that Occidental invested in? Last April, at a peer review with the Advanced Leadership Biophysics Conference, got a unanimous 4 thumbs down on their technology. But on the other hand, companies like Lanzatech and Opus and people that are, I think, really got some really good technology. Alum cycle carbon capture systems don't get very much coverage. And so I kind of have two questions. How about, can you cover things that aren't getting covered, cover the things that aren't being talked about? DME is a great molecule, but nobody's talking about it, nobody's going to be able to push it. And second, have you ever got caught in writing about a story that afterwards you think you shouldn't have written about?
Great question. So we've got, what are readers most likely to misunderstand in your stories? A question about infrastructure and the importance of infrastructure. How do you discern which technology you're going to pay attention to and write about? Do you go by the merits of the technology in a vacuum? Do you just say, well, it's whichever big players are behind it, even if that's not the optimal technology, that's the one I should cover because that's where the money's going and the attention's going to go? And then, of course, do you regret any stories after the fact? I should also mention, I can already tell we're going to have more questions today than we can fill the time with. So also feel free to engage with us on Twitter at AC Global Energy. That's at AC Global Energy. or engage also with any of our guests. And if you go to @AC Global Energy, you'll see all of their hashtags as well. And we'll hopefully continue the conversation after this. But let's dive right into that trio of great questions.
I'll take the last one because I think the last one's pretty simple in a way to answer. To get wonky about it, carbon engineering is doing something that is radically different, which is why it's getting the interest. To capture carbon dioxide from the air is really expensive. And so why is it getting scale at this stage in our climate fight is an interesting question to try and answer. Sure, it has money behind it, and that's probably why it's interesting. But on a technology spectrum, it's radically out there, and so that's why you want to try and understand why it's there. LanzaTech, not many people might know, but it's a company that converts steel gas or carbon monoxide, so not carbon dioxide, but carbon monoxide into biofuels using microbes of many kinds that they've genetically engineered. And it is at a scale where it's producing millions of gallons of this fuel now. I think the reason they are not covered or are not that well known is because biofuels have gone through a cycle of hype and problems. Biofuels 1.0 or 2.0 were, have probably put out more emissions than fossil fuels would have, and that we know now from studies done. LanzaTech has a promise, but here's the bias that a technology develops. If it's got problems, to be able to come back and solve it requires a much greater push from the industry. So LanzaTech, stands out as a sole example there, and if we have more, I'm sure it'll get attention. I would also say it's not fair that you worry that the media is not covering the right story. We are really competitive here. We work for private organizations that want to make profits. They don't make profits, but want to make profits. And so if there is a good story, you can bet that we will cover it. What makes a good story is a difficult question.
What about, infrastructure is a great one, and so I want to ask it in a different way.
Okay.
There are a lot of villains that pop up in climate discussions, in climate debates, in climate journalism. One of the villains that I think is undercovered, I'll be provocative here, is NIMBYism.
Yes.
Why doesn't that make it into more stories? Is it difficult to cover? Is it not a personified enough adversary, even when it's blocking the development of something which will help us get more low carbon or zero carbon resources on the grid? How do you as a journalist engage with NIMBYism as a phenomena?
Well, is it NIMBYism or is it, environmentalism or what is it? So
it's a great point, right? It's in the eye of the beholder there.
So it is in the eye of the beholder, and I think that right now, the administration is taking steps to try to make it easier to, work through states that are trying to block certain infrastructure projects and kind of limit the authority they have with the Clean Water Act permits. So New York State blocking a key pipeline. That's not necessarily NIMBYism, or it is. Maybe it's in the eye of the beholder. And I feel like in some ways energy and environment is a very, it's one of these issues that is maybe perceived. Maybe this is one of the misperceptions. It's perceived as a red and blue issue. In some ways, it is in terms of states versus Washington right now. So yeah, I think it's only going to get more difficult. There are more lawsuits that are coming, particularly on this issue coming up with the Clean Water Act, Section 401 permits and infrastructure. But I don't know. So we cover it because it's interesting, and sometimes we cover it if groups have been camped out along a pipeline for a long time, and it's attracting a lot of attention. But it raises a lot of other issues, which are in some ways, if it's a tribe, it is about their sovereignty. if it's an environmental group, it is about differences over how federal and private land should be used. So I don't know.
It's a great point. It's not black and white at all.
Yeah, and it's also a slow evolving story, and which can be difficult to cover, especially with the current media landscape where you don't always get the opportunity to be able to spend time. So recently I read Superpower by Russell Gold, who's a Wall Street Journal reporter, and it's a story about this one person's wish to try and build transmission lines across the central US, where you try and take renewable energy from the central parts to the coasts. And it took him 2 years to be able to report that. Part of that was NIMBYism. There was a strong group of people who were opposing having transmission lines in their backyards. And so to try and find the character who's running this or has influence over it, it's a long and hard job to do. And it does get covered. It just gets covered in different ways because of the difficulty of the reporting.
Absolutely. I want to ask a question about intersectionality. The climate and the energy transition debate or discussion here in the United States, and most notably through the Green New Deal, is touching on more issues and concepts than it perhaps has in the past. Issues like equity, like justice, like the quality and not just the quantity of economic growth. Is that creating new opportunities for new stories for you? How are you choosing to cover that? Do you think you figured it out yet, or are you still grappling with it? Let's start with you, Justin, and then I kind of want to come this way. And by the time I get to you, Akshat, I want to get your thoughts watching this from London. What is it? How does it inform the way that you look at your own debates and discussions in the UK and in Europe and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that there is this additional attention to issues that sometimes it could be difficult to get stories off the ground about, right? I mean, I think there is more interest in writing about environmental justice now than there would have been when I pitched stories on that topic 3 years ago. And I think that's in large part due to that interest and that push from activists. I guess I don't know. I guess that's all
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No, one of the aspects of that, I mean, in discussing the Green New Deal, in addition to environmental justice, there's a lot of discussion about what is a just transition for these frontline communities, and those are both the communities that are most affected by climate change or by water pollution in urban areas like Flint. But it's also a question about what about the communities that would be affected by a rapid move away from fossil fuels, so coal miners and those who work in manufacturing and so on. There's a lot of skepticism. I've covered this just transition issue, looking at coal miners and speaking to the head of the president of the United Mine Workers Association. There's a lot of skepticism about what is a just transition. And the Green New Deal spends a lot of the words in the kind of Green New Deal resolution address, it would seem like a great thing for coal miners who are not, let's face it, they're not in a great state right now. They're not getting paid. They're in these bankruptcies that are happening. Their paychecks are, not coming through. So where are their protections? But there's still a lot of skepticism, even though the Green New Deal does address that, does address their plight. There's a lot of skepticism about what it means and whether it's just, a way of, forcing them to work in the renewables industry, which they don't necessarily want to do. So I think it's an interesting way to have this discussion. I think it will be interesting to see if the Democratic candidates will accept an offer by the United Mine Workers president to go into a coal mine. I would love to see the discussions that they have, because I think that will be very interesting. And it could potentially force an interesting, could be an interesting, topic in the general election against Donald Trump when it comes to what did you really do for coal miners and for those workers that supported you.
It's actually good to ask this question from a perspective of somebody who's outside the US looking at it, because if you look at what's happening in the UK, as Justin pointed out, you have all-party support for climate action. You have a net zero emissions by 2050 goal legally binding in place. It's also happened because the industrial economy in the UK is smaller. There aren't that many coal miners left in the UK. There aren't that many oil and gas people in the UK. There used to be in the North Sea. That's not the case. And so the buy-in has been easier, but also the science has been easier to, or has been better communicated and accepted by the people. Now you look at that, you take that perspective, and then you look at the US, and you have, the science is still very clear and communicated, but you have these bad actors who are trying to deny it. And that has essentially taken over the conversation, had taken over the conversation for the longest time here in the US. And that, I think, was the problem, that in some way climate scientists failed here in the US to then show that it's not just about telling you that we need to cut emissions. It affects each of these aspects that you've raised: social justice, environmental non-greenhouse gas impacts, air pollution. All those things get better if you focus on climate action. And I think that failure of climate scientists, partially, not just on their own, it can be understood now how quickly Green Deal ideologies or ideas are taking off, because it was a gap that needed to be filled, that somebody needed to communicate this is the scale of the challenge, and this is the scale of the solutions that can be applied. And it's heartening to see it.
Absolutely. So speaking of the science, right, the US's traditional problem has been just getting that widespread acceptance of the science, right, and getting policy to reflect science. I want to ask if we may have a, perhaps not an equally grave, but another interesting issue in the communication of the science from the other side. It's a common refrain that we hear is that we have 12 years to solve this. Scientists tell us we have 12 years to get this right. The IPCC 1.5 degree report says we've got 12 years before a climate catastrophe. The person who taught me climate science was actually a professor in the UK by the name of Miles Allen, who's one of the two leading co-authors on the IPCC 1.5 degree report. I know himself, as a leading climate scientist, is a little bit uncomfortable with sometimes the way that this gets played out, particularly in the US political debate, worrying that if we reach year 13 and the world has gotten marginally warmer and we're getting marginally worse severe weather and it's getting marginally more uncomfortable, but we haven't fallen off the face of the earth yet, that you're going to have some disillusionment in the communicators, the political communicators of the science. How do you deal with that? Does that cross your mind? How do you grapple with the communication of things like the 1.5 degree report and this 12-year horizon that's being discussed?
Yeah, please. I think the IPCC does a fantastic job, right? They are a huge bureaucratic nightmare, but yet they produce a report that you cannot find holes in. That is an achievement that we should all be proud of, that you can get people across all these countries, scientists across all these different universities working together on one document and producing it. I mean, the land and climate change report that came today just got passed the night before. You had there was a photo of the convention in Geneva, everybody sitting in front of computers, agreeing that yes, this is the document we passed. So I don't think it's right to fault their communication at all. The 12 years does not come from the IPCC report. It comes from a media report about the IPCC report. So I became a vegetarian, a traveling vegetarian, I call myself. When I'm at home, I eat only vegetarian. When I travel, I partake in different cuisines because I want to be able to make the most of my travels. Because of
Anthony Bourdain,
yes, because of the UN Livestock's Long Shadow report that was published earlier in the century, and so UN reports have huge impact. The 1.5C report, apart from the 12 years, did accelerate a lot of discussion on climate action, especially on negative emissions. And so I think the 12 years thing, is probably on the same spectrum as climate denial. It's a small part of the climate discussion that gets disproportionate attention.
Well, I think the 12 years framing did one very important thing, is it gave a lot of the activists who are now very vocal and are shutting down cities and are forcing candidates to take positions, they've used that 12 years narrative to their advantage, and it's a slogan. It's something that you can put on a sign, and I think in that sense, that's the kind of that's where we see the product of that framing. But as an activist tool, but as far as, I can see some of the negative impacts of that framing when, year 13 rolls around, and then people begin to question the science again, because that's the narrative that they've been sold. But it's easy for editors, it's easy for activists, and there's a potential danger in conveying that. And we should probably be clear in advising against that framing as it is.
Yeah, I think just to add the context and the specifics of what 12 years means, it doesn't mean that in 12 years, we're all going to die, but then to include that in the story, right? So if we're going to reference the 12 years number, we need a sentence that explains very precisely what that means, and not, I think you're right to point to the activist community has used it, latched onto it, and elevated it so that now it's something that even someone who doesn't follow this will know. It can be hard to, even having the voice of a media outlet, it can be hard to combat that and explain that when you've got really people who are getting a lot of attention repeating a line.
Absolutely. So it may be, we may want to do more of, in 12 years, we will have committed ourselves,
right,
because of the nature, the lag and the temperature effect of the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere.
Well, and to be fair to the scientists, there has been a lot of pushback from climate scientists on the 12-year narrative. If anything, what they now clearly say is we just don't have time. We should be cutting emissions now.
Absolutely.
So there's no 12-year window left. We should start cutting emissions.
Because the other danger there is on the other side, that you've got 12 years to figure it out. So let's wait until year 10, right, and hopefully technology will be better then. No, we can't afford to not act today. Absolutely. Let's go back out to the audience for some questions. Let's see. We're going to take two right there from that middle row, and then we're going to come right back over here to the front for the third question.
Afternoon. Justin Locke with Rocky Mountain Institute. It appears that the climate migration nexus in Europe is quite strong, and that narrative is very well understood with North Africa, but it hasn't necessarily connected here in the United States with Central America. And I wonder if you're seeing any anecdotes or evidence of that nexus as well.
Great. One other question in this room?
Sure. Thanks. I'm Dave Poemi from Energy Materials Corp. My question, this is really hard for me to get out because I've been in the solar and renewable energy industry 22 years, but what I don't see covered much is the challenges of scaling the renewables industry in the next 30 years if we're going to meet these kind of timelines. If you look at the solar industry, it's regardless of the scenarios that are forecasting different renewable energy types of floors. I mean, if you look at solar energy, it's specifically talked about 20% of all global energy, and it's quite a bit higher in other scenarios. That is roughly 500 gigawatts a year of solar. So the resources for that, doing it within planetary boundaries, so you're not escalating the ecological overshoot problem. So I'm curious if you're hearing much of that or covering that.
Great. And then the lady here in the second row.
Hi, my name is Amandine Mouscous. I work for Kia Motors. But my question is a little bit deeper than that. I've heard both, you mentioned the Green New Deal, and then also to talk kind of about making the whole climate debate accessible to the public, but really there's a deeper question of what are we communicating or not communicating to those who legislate and regulate, and how do you feel that your journalistic position really has an obligation to communicate that kind of information to the regulators and legislators in your respective countries and commentary?
That's great. So we've got a question on the climate migration nexus, a question on scaling clean tech in time, scaling renewables in time, and third, communicating to policymakers and regulators. And I'd actually be curious in answering that, maybe you can each say, to what degree do you feel like you or your publication, your venue is communicating to that audience? Because it probably differs for each of you. Justin, why don't we start with you?
Well, yeah, on the last question, I think it's funny, if I go up to the Hill, every office is going to have a Time magazine. Will they have read it? I don't know. I don't think. I mean, I think the way that we play in that discussion is more, in the sort of dialogue that it might create. If we have a story that creates a dialogue and maybe leads a constituent to call them, I think without. If we break news or something, it might have some sort of effect on policymakers. But I don't think that if I write a feature on climate politics, that an informed legislator is going to maybe it'll change their mind. I don't know. In short, I don't know. I would hope that it does, but I'm not sure.
For Time, particularly the print edition,
yeah,
does the real utility or the power of Time now truly lay in the cover? I feel like you see that the cover is something that's easy to tweet. Yeah. It's something it's something that you see reproduced even beyond just the print edition of the magazine. Do you feel like there's almost it's one of those instances where there's 100-to-1 delta between the impact of the cover and the impact of the articles inside?
I mean, oftentimes, not necessarily. I mean, I think clearly our cover gets shared on social. It gets it's revealed oftentimes on Morning Joe, and people are talking about it throughout the day. So there's a clear impact easily from the cover, but we do good journalism as well inside, and I think it's interesting. We still have, I won't say the number because I might get it wrong, but we still have millions of subscribers who get our magazine every day, and many of whom, or every week, excuse me, and many of whom actually read through the entire thing. So there is that impact, and that is not insignificant.
Absolutely. Valerie?
I think, particularly with when it comes to California and other states versus the EPA or the Interior Department, I think that we do. We do. Our headlines do reach state regulators in that sense of that kind of states versus EPA or Washington story.
I'll take the climate nexus one. I don't know as much about the U.S. And you're right. Probably there's less academic studies as well. Interestingly, last week there was a story in The Guardian which I featured in my newsletter, which was astonishing to me. So in the last 2 years, about 850,000 Guatemalans have been affected by droughts. 168,000 have then been arrested at the southern US border. If that's not causation, I don't know what stronger causation you want that climate change is playing an impact, is having an impact on the migration patterns that we are seeing around the world. As for the first question,
climate migration nexus and then scaling clean tech in time.
I think that question is a good question, and my reporting at least has told me that essentially the difficulty is that big money hasn't come into the renewable space in the way that it should. Right? Big money is in the oil and gas industry through either index funds or direct investments or sovereign wealth fund investments. That money is yet to come to renewables. It's starting to happen. The Norwegian sovereign wealth fund dumping some of the pure exploration companies. ironically, Occidental was one of them. And then moving some of that money towards renewable projects, direct investments in renewable projects, is a sign in which scaling up can happen. I don't know about the 500 gigawatt figure, but I do think that as big money moves from the carbon intensive industries to renewables, we'll see that shift accelerate.
And what's been the number one preventative thing to date? Is it a lack of understanding the return structure of renewables as an asset class, or is it something different? Do you think it's something more nefarious in terms of incentive structures or things like that?
I think there would be other factors, but information flow is definitely a key problem. So when an analyst at a bank is sitting down and trying to say, okay, we have 10 billion that we need to invest with a 2%, 2.5% return over the next 30 years, what can we invest in? You don't get somebody explaining this renewable project would be giving you those returns. There's just an information gap in how renewable projects are presented to these large money asset managers. And at least that's what I've been able to glean from some of the reporting so far. It's a really interesting space to be in. Again, I think it's the lag. We'll see that coming through, but who are the actors that can accelerate it? Sort of shareholder activism might be one way to do it, where shareholders are forcing carbon intensive industries to do the right thing, but at the same time start looking at what are the opportunities that they can invest in. But yeah, it's a difficult problem.
And then in September there'll be 2 televised events, not necessarily climate debates, but climate town halls that all the Democrats will participate in. More than half of them have pledged to achieve a 100% renewables target by 2030 or sometime around then. I think it would be a great time to hear from each candidate how, because right now we're lacking in a lot of those specifics.
That's great. And let's take another round of questions then from the audience. We've got one question at the far back, very far back. We'll start with that, and then we'll come up this row.
Hello, I'm Gilead Gary. I'm representing Free 99. We're an artist-driven think tank. So I want to ask the panel, how do you guys feel about art playing a role in climate change?
Terrific, thank you. Question on art and climate change. We've got a question right over here, the inner part of the central section.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I intern with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I'm wondering if you personally feel like you have any sort of emotional attachment or stake in the transition, or if you're covering it kind of agnostically as if you would a sports game or something. And if the former is true, what have been the most compelling ways to communicate the urgency of the climate crisis to a lot of different audiences who are coming at the issue from a lot of different values, given that the environmental appeal doesn't always appeal to everyone. And what have been the most compelling ways you've been able to do that?
That's great. And then let's take one question up here, and then we'll come back around to this side for the next round of questions.
Thank you. I'm Greg Merritt with the Smart Electric Power Alliance. I want to ask a question. Maybe it's a little more academic, journalistic question than some of the ones that perhaps are a little more complex. You mentioned in your introduction the complexity of the issue, and you also mentioned the commitments to by utilities, cities, governments, corporations to energy goals. This is one representative question I think was a larger problem. The language we use when we talk about these things is not necessarily universally understood, but it's important. And I'll give you an example. 100% renewables as a goal versus carbon-free as a goal versus net zero as a goal versus carbon neutral as a goal. Most of those mean fundamentally different things. And in fact, they all sound like they're carbon-free, but they're not. What do you think as journalists? I know it's difficult, right? You said you try to explain things that you include. How much effort do you put into trying to make sure the audience understands the language you're using?
3, again, great question. So we've got one on art and climate change. And let me throw in there actually that at least some photojournalism and some of the videos I've seen put together by news organizations recently on climate change, I personally would say verges on, it is journalism, but it's also art in some cases. The visual impact, the emotional impact is so striking, and it's so thoughtfully put together and so creatively and artistically conceived that you almost have news organizations in covering climate change are putting together climate art as well. So let me get your thoughts on that. Number 2, do you have a personal stake in these issues? And how does that inform your journalism? And then number 3, the being careful with our terminology. And this is important, I'll just say, for not just you as news organizations, but also for us as independent think tanks to be very careful about the language that we use in describing policies and being accurate in that.
I'll start with the art question, because I had this discussion with my wife over the weekend. My editor-in-chief encouraged me to start working on a book earlier this year. And over breakfast, I suggested to her, if I do publish a book, I'd love to have like an art project alongside it. And she rolled her eyes, because I'm not an artist by any means. And so I'd love to be able to collaborate with people who know what art is. I said, I think the best thing I've read on the lack of art in climate is the book by Amitav Ghosh. He's an Indian writer, called The Great Derangement. It was his, I think, the first nonfiction book that he wrote about how there is a lack of climate in fiction. And he's walking the talk, and he's just got a novel out about with a climate, which has now become a genre after he wrote the book, called cli-fi. And so we are starting to see that come through, and I think it's essential that art be a part of the discussion. The final thing I'd say is Extinction Rebellion for capturing the 12 years and taking it to another extreme and saying humans are going to go extinct by climate change. Not going to happen. We'll be very badly off if we don't do anything about it, but humans are cockroaches of this planet. We are not going anywhere. Not because of climate change anyway. But they have great art, and their art is now, art in activism, and it's going to be displayed at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And so we are starting to see art break into climate, and I'm very happy that that's happening.
Yeah, and so at Reuters, we obviously have some of the best photographers in the world, and I think the climate stories, when they get to tag along on those assignments, are some of their favorites to capture, and there have been some iconic photos recently with melting glaciers that I think they really resonate with people. I think they scare people and kind of, in a way that is very often more powerful than words. So,
I guess I'll try the second question, which is a tricky one. Of course, as a human on the planet, I have a stake, but you also, at the same time, as a journalist, have to take a step back and try to tell the story, and not try to tell the story in a way that is and somewhat dispassionate, but also to allow people and their stories to speak for the stake that we all have, rather than making my own sort of feelings, my own stake, part of that story.
I would answer that question by saying that, journalists and activists, there are people who are journalists and activists, and then there are journalists and activists, right? I would say to think about it from an activism perspective, you simplify your message, and then you try and explain the complexity behind the message most of the time. As I see it, I'm not an activist. You've got the 12 years, and then you try and explain why those 12 years are important, why we need to do things now. I think journalists start from the other side, where they go, here's a problem, here is how you might be able to solve it. And so they some way come somewhere in the middle anyway, to be able to deal with the complexity. I think journalists try and do that from the get-go rather than the other way around. And I think that addresses some of the questions that you raised, which was, how do you explain the difference between these 5 net zero and carbon neutrality and and 100% renewables. I deeply care about that difference, and I mean, I think everybody should, because it's really important. I mean, the carbon, the net zero emissions goals that lots of countries and states and cities are setting are really different. Yes. Some are net zero carbon dioxide emissions, some are net zero greenhouse gas emissions, some are net zero emissions that do not include flights coming from abroad, so only territorial flight emissions. It's all over the place, and so. But I think that needs to be tackled and explained to the audience. And I think just repetition of every time there's a story about it, you try and explain the difference, and that's how you do it, I think.
Yeah, and my challenge on that, very often some of our stories are quite short, some of the kind of spot news stories, and then if very often I'll try to explain the difference between carbon neutral or net zero, and very often it gets kind of, in the editing process, simplified to something else, and that's a real challenge, actually, trying to convey those important differences, but in a very kind of few amount of words that can get through the copy desk, and that's my challenge. But I think it's an important reminder to stick with it, because there are big differences.
I think we are in a much better place than we were when the IPCC, I think, fourth assessment said we should have 80% reduction compared to 1990 levels by 2050. Nobody understood that. So at least net zero is easier, and so we are getting somewhere in trying to explain the goals.
Yeah. The other thing that's important too, that I think we overlook a lot, is making sure we're clear about the distinctions between targets, goals, aspirations, binding legislation, executive orders, which can be easily, kind of reversed, legislative actions, which are harder to reverse maybe. For example, sometimes these internal combustion engine bans out in 2040 or 2045 are somewhat breathlessly reported. And I think, in all honesty, the folks who are announcing them probably know that, right? They know that that's going to be difficult to legislate. They can shape market expectations, at least on the margin, through that sort of announcement, even though it's perhaps uncertain if it'll stick or not, or be pushed off into the future. Let's take another round of questions from this side before we have to wrap things up. We'll go 1, 2, and 3.
Richard Coleman, CBP, retired. I remember when John Denver, the singer, was Rocky Mountain High, it was reported that he had his own gas tank in his front yard, and everybody was shocked and horrified that he was kind of a symbol of clean air and healthy living. And I saw an article recently about European shaming for flying. And I'm just wondering, thinking of smoking, if there will ever be an energy hog shaming movement, and if that story is going to grow.
Hi there, Michelle Brechtelsbauer, Energy Impact Center. One of the things that I don't think we've talked about a lot today is nuclear energy. It's one of the most critically recognized technologies for addressing climate change. And I'm hoping you can all talk about it, and especially talk about kind of the differences the United States and the United Kingdom are taking right now. Thank you.
Great question. And then there was a question at the very back.
Hi, Jessie Stolark with Third Way. My question is about Republican legislatures and Republican voters. We've heard a lot about how, whether it's the Green New Deal or the administration, has influenced both activists on the left as well as the 2020 primary cycle. And I'm wondering if your reporting or your kind of tracking of Republican views has changed as well in the last couple of years, and what you think might be kind of impacting those conversations.
Great. So 3 terrific questions to bring us home. We've got climate energy shaming. The choices by some activists, perhaps, also to take boats to major summits or events rather than planes. 2, a question on nuclear. We oftentimes talk about, if only we had a zero carbon baseload technology, which wasn't intermittent like wind and solar, wouldn't we be in a really good place? Well, we've had nuclear energy for years. France has 80% of its electricity delivered from nuclear. So where is that going? Where does that factor into your journalism? And then 3, evolution perhaps in Republican thinking or Republican strategy around climate. Do you sense that, and how do you report that?
I can start with the last question. Yeah, I think that actually the one of the interesting aspects of the Green New Deal becoming very much a part of the energy and environment discussion is that it's kind of drawn Republicans back into part of the solutions around climate change. We're seeing more proposals around carbon fees or some kind of carbon pricing. There's a Republican caucus, the Roosevelt caucus, that's forming to try to find moderate solutions around climate change. And I think that the aggressive nature of the Green New Deal has pulled some of the Republicans back into things. They see, because I think they can see that the polling shows that there's widespread support for some kind of climate action. They see the youth, they see that they have a youth problem, that young people overwhelmingly, regardless of party, support climate change actions. And they realize they're now needing to do something. I think the Green New Deal gives them a little more space to come up with proposals that they can say are more realistic and implementable. And we're starting to see lots more proposals, including from some of President Trump's allies, like Matt Gaetz in California, who had his own Green New Deal proposal. And I think that's a very interesting kind of side effect of the Green New Deal discussions.
I can take the flickskam is the Swedish word for flying shame or flight shame. And it's actually a phenomena, and it's a good thing, I think. There are places in Europe that you can get to via trains that are not easily accessible via flights. And so you're starting to see, Sweden was recorded the first reduction in number of flights ever since we started flying last year, because people are taking more trains. And as a climate journalist from London who's just flown in this morning to come do this event, I'm hyper aware that I have a carbon footprint, and I think I am probably a fraction of the population that is aware of their carbon footprint. So having a shaming activism movement is a good thing, because more people will be aware of this. And I think there are solutions to it. So Catherine Hayhoe was a climate scientist at Texas Tech University, had a good response to how do you deal with being a climate scientist and going around and flying and giving talks. And she said, I try and minimize my travel, and so that's what and combine things when I do, and so that's what I tend to do. Next week we are going to Chicago for an event, and I'll be in Boston for a workshop, and I'm making sure that one cross-Atlantic flight does, it's worth the carbon footprint. More people should think about it, and I think it's a good thing.
Terrific.
I guess I really don't have much to add on any of those.
Yeah, terrific. Let me ask one final question then, as we wrap up here.
We didn't address the nuclear.
Oh yeah, we got, of course, nuclear. Yeah.
I think it's
Akshat,
a very,
please.
very good question, and it's a bit sad how quickly nuclear has fallen off the agenda. Of course, it's not the case in the UK, which continues to back it. I think there is less and more should be written about this, which is there is a military nuclear win-win for countries that have nuclear weapons, where having personnel who are trained in handling either submarines or weapons in other forms, then have lives after they've finished their service in the nuclear industry, in the power sector, is a national security investment that countries make, which is the UK's reason to be investing in nuclear, even though it costs a lot more than other sources of electricity today. The other thing that makes me laugh about nuclear is that most of the delays come in concrete or steel, or it's not the radiation, it's not the complex nuclear physics that is required to run these plants. It's these other things that are a problem. And so I think it gives me hope that there are small modular reactors that are coming where those would be standardized, and you don't have to have a plant design from scratch built for every plant. And so we might just get to a point within the next 10 years or so where these technologies are able to be price competitive because they are zero carbon and base load, and hopefully we have a carbon price that allows them to compete. But yeah.
Absolutely. Akshat, you've teed me up perfectly to mention two different things, two different projects here at the Atlantic Council we're extremely proud of and excited about. Number one is we just wrapped up a task force on the future of nuclear energy leadership here in the United States. It's a bipartisan task force chaired by Senator Crapo and Senator Whitehouse. And it touched on not only the climate imperative there, but also the national security imperative, the interlinkages and synergies that exist there. It emphasized the role that advanced nuclear small modular reactors are going to have in the future, and the importance of the U.S. leaning into those new technologies that may have answers to some of the conventional challenges facing conventional light water nuclear reactors. And then you talked also about workforce development and about jobs for veterans that may work on a nuclear submarine. Next week, you'll be with me out in Chicago at an event we're doing on Tuesday, August 13th, called the Veterans Advanced Energy Summit. We'll be in Chicago all day. Elected officials like Representative Sean Casten, former officials like Senator Kelly Ayotte, leading thinkers and experts in energy markets and energy businesses, all discussing opportunities for veterans and those involved in national security jobs here in the United States and elsewhere to, in their civilian careers, contribute to advanced energy leadership and furthering the technologies, the business models, et cetera, that'll be needed to scale in order to address these challenges. So thanks very much for that. For those of you who will be in Chicago, please join us. For those of you who are based here in DC, we'll be live streaming that event all day. So I encourage you to go to vetsenergysummit.org and tune in the day of. As we come to a close today, as we come to a conclusion, we really hope to make this an annual event. I neglected to say we did this last year with energy journalists. We did this year, and we hope to do this again quite often in the future. Perhaps we'll also be doing one of these events with some Cli-Fi authors to come, so or Sci-Cli, whatever you might want to call it. So with that, please join me in thanking these three esteemed journalists who have been so generous with their time today. So much. Thanks, Akshat. That's really fun.